We like to call it the Supernatural Hour. And now, our hosts.
You have arrived at the Supernatural Hour podcast, and I'm one of your many hosts, Raven.
I'm Chad.
And I'm Rogue.
And Doc's not here today because he's doing some emergency medical stuff.
Yep, he was planning on coming until literally an hour ago, so...
We'll miss him, but he's doing more important things than what we're doing here.
Yep, hence the name Emergency.
So for our main topic, we're going to talk about, it's some more for the Halloween spooky season, but it's brought to you by Castle Photo Art.
And he actually took our photos as APS, Advanced Paranormal WISPs personnel, and he sent me some. We're actually going to go get some more because the light went away a little quicker than we were expecting it to. And he wasn't able to take as many pictures as he would have liked, but the few that he did get are really cool. I really like them. Yeah.
And he does nature pictures, he does photo art, portraits, all sorts of things. So for those of you that have been longtime listeners, that's Castle, that was one of the original founders of this podcast.
That's our Castle. This is kind of our third of our Salem Witch Trial Halloween series, and we're going to talk today about some graveyard stories because it's Halloween, and who doesn't like graveyard stories? We're going to talk a little bit first about some graveyard stories of the Salem Witch Trial Cemetery. It's actually the second oldest cemetery in the country. It's called Old Burying Point Cemetery, and it was established in 1637. Not only because of its age, but every occupant at Burying Point really holds some historical importance. Because, 1637, there's not a whole lot of people, and the ones that were here were pretty cool. I mean, we don't call them pioneers, but they were literally pioneers of their time and their age and everything that was going on at that time. Well, there's a name, if you go to the cemetery, of a man named John Hawthorne, and it's spelled Hathorne. And he was actually a judge, one of the judges during the Salem witch trials. And if you read, the accounts of his involvement with the witch trials, he was pretty unapologetic about it. And even up to his deathbed, there was no deathbed repentance for him. Even on his deathbed, he was like, yeah, I judged them. They were witches. They were awful. He pretty much stuck to his guns. And whether it's because he truly believed it or didn't want to, he was just trying to save face, I don't know. But here's the kicker. So John Hawthorne, this witch trial judge, is the great-great-grandfather of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous writer. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was so ashamed of what his great-great-grandfather did that he added a W to his name, because Nathaniel Hawthorne, the writer, is Hawthorne. And he did that hoping that he could hide the fact that they were related. Oh, they're not related. He doesn't have a W in the name, which I thought was interesting.
And then came the internet, and everybody knows.
Now we all know. Now I am telling, our 15 listeners about it. Okay, but there's some other names associated with the witch trial at Burying Point. There's a memorial for those wrongly accused. It's kind of at the front of the cemetery. And again, it's not where they were buried. It's just memorials. And it's interesting because when you go there, we went there, and people come and they still put flowers on there. There's little flowers and little tokens, some people put coins. Some people have put little pieces of candy or little teeny stuffed animals, but they're still remembered. And then there's headstones of, I think it's funny when I was reading this, they called them the pious chastisers. But basically their accusers are all buried there, which is interesting because, you think of all the upheaval and all the turmoil at the time, and they're all just, at some point we all die and we're all basically put into the same ground. But when you go there, it's kind of like taking a step back in time. Like there's a line almost between when, wicked people and innocent people was really blurry. with everything that went on. But some others that were laid to rest at Old Burying Point were some people from the Mayflower, like Captain Richard Moore, and the last governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and his name was Simon Bradstreet. So, as you can guess, it's a super, super popular cemetery, because of Salem witch trials. I mean, that's a big thing. Everybody knows about it. And every year, especially kind of this fall, Halloween-y type of year, just tons of people go back there to visit. And there's another draw, which features a memorial to those people who died in the witch trial. And just behind the memorial are where the graves are. So there's the memorial, and then right behind them is where their accusers are buried. It's also known as the Charter Street Cemetery. It's the oldest cemetery in Salem and the second oldest in the nation, which we mentioned before. The total number of people buried there are 347. So it's not huge.
No, that's not very large at all.
But it's
Are
creepy.
the tomb or the headstones, are they upright or are they on the ground?
So the memorials, which aren't, they're just the memorials. There's a wall and they kind of stick out of the wall. So, you wouldn't sit on them because that would be like sacrilegious or something, but it's almost like they make a chair. So like the wall is the back and then the memorial would be like the seat. They're a little longer.
Oh.
It would make it weird to be a chair, but they kind of stick out long way. But if I remember right, the headstones are the standy up kind.
Mm-hmm.
Do you like that word, standy up kind?
Standy, I think you're trademarked it. I think you just trademarked it.
Yeah. They're not flush to the ground now because they didn't have lawnmowers back in the day that they had to worry about. They just let the sheep out. I was going for a
I
laugh.
like that.
Nobody laughed. That's okay. I'm used to it. I'm not funny. Even though Nathaniel Hawthorne kind of tried to distance himself from his second great-grandfather, he did recognize the importance of this dark era. And as you read, I don't know if you've ever read Hawthorne's writings, but as you'll read that, you'll kind of see in some of his character names homages to the ones that are carved into these graves at Old Burying Point. And it's believed, I don't know that he's ever said, but it's believed that some of his interest in this area stems from some late night strolls. He had his wife. Her name was Sophia, and she suffered from chronic migraines. And so to kind of help get her mind off of the pain of these migraines, he would take her for walks. And they would walk around the neighborhood. Oftentimes it was at night because that's when her headaches would flare up. And, it's not a very big area. And Nathaniel Hawthorne lived quite a long time ago. It still wasn't very big when he was around. And so oftentimes their walks would go past the cemetery. And after seeing these names night after night after night, they just kind of stuck in his head. So one of his works that's probably the most notable that was influenced most likely by these walks is The House of Seven Gables. And this, I have never read this book, but the novel follows the New England family and their mysterious house. And throughout the story, Hawthorne explores the aftermath of some of these witchcraft accusations. So one of the characters in this book, The House of Seven Gables, is Hephzibah Pyncheon. And if you've read the book and that's not how it's pronounced, I'm sorry. I'm actually kind of intrigued in reading this. But people believe that her name came from one of these strolls. As one of the headstones in this cemetery has the person named Hephzibah Packer. And it's just not a super popular name. If someone were to say the name Hephzibah to me, I would think ancient Egypt. That sounds like the name of a pharaoh.
Imhotep, Hephzibah.
Right? Anyway, so if we go back to the real Hephzibah Drake Packer, she was not involved in the witchcraft hysteria. She actually died about 10 years before the Salem witch trials occurred. And as far as we know, she died with no scandal. She was probably a young wife, 25 years old, so she may have had a couple of children. So people might think, well, why would he pick her name? I want to say it's a very unusual name, but this was a time when people were named things like Chastity and, what are some of those other names of the time?
Hope.
Prudence. And you still hear some of those names. I mean, I know some people nowadays named Chastity, but just with the religion of the time and how religious everybody was, a lot of the girls' names had some of those unusual names. But one of the things that could have stuck out in Hawthorne's mind was her gravestone, which had the carving of Death's head on it. And having a carving of Death's head was not super common. It's not an uncommon sight today. But at the time, it wasn't. It was actually quite popular a little bit later. It's a skull brandishing angel wings. And no matter how many times you see that, it's still going to kind of catch your eye. So it wasn't too much longer after this that this death head kind of became the it grave marker. So, I mean, it's one of those things, someone wears it and then everyone has to jump on the bandwagon. And we're not exactly sure if Hephzibah is the one who started the whole death head craze. But it's definitely gained popularity and
I remember
was
when we
eye-catching.
were in Boston and we were down in Boston Commons and some of those graveyards that were down in that area, and this would be more around the 1700s. But there were a lot of the gravestones that did have those. But again, like you said, that was a later era, and hers was earlier in the 1640s or so when that was there, and it wasn't as common. A little later, 100 years later, it was a lot more common on a lot of those old gravestones in Boston.
Right, and one of the reasons it became so popular is they determined it to symbolize both one's physical death and one's spiritual regeneration. So the skull being the physical death, and then the wings being the regeneration of the spirit.
Interesting.
As most cemeteries, it's haunted, right? So some of the strange occurrences are widely believed to be supernatural because this was the age of the witch. And so this wasn't just later. This was, as soon as you break ground and bury somebody, stuff starts happening. It's also an era that many chose to discredit all these strange occurrences because of all the hysteria. So it kind of depended where you were at the time. But let's put the witch hysteria aside. We've already talked about that in our last podcast, but there are nearly 400 years of ghostly accounts at the cemetery. So we figure if you've got that many accounts, there's got to be something going on. So I'm going to quote some Nathaniel Hawthorne. If you are uncultured swine as I am, if you're like me and you've never read much of Nathaniel Hawthorne, here we go. We're going to become cultured. You ready? He says, there is a fatality, a feeling so irresistible and inevitable that it has the force of doom, which almost invariably compels human beings to linger around and haunt, ghost-like, the spot where some great and marked event has given color to their lifetime, and still the more irresistibly, the darker the tinge that saddens it. And I love that. It really makes me want to read more of him. Because even though he was appalled by what happened and appalled of what his second great-grandfather, his part in it, he still says it's a terrible event, but it has given color to their life. It's given, something to make their life not boring. I don't know how else to say it. Obviously, I'm not a famous writer. I can't say eloquent things like Nathaniel Hawthorne, so there's that. But a lot of people in that area really echo Hawthorne's sentiment, and they believe that the grounds of Old Burying Point are saturated with restless spirits, and that it's probably one of the most, if not the most haunted site, not only in Massachusetts, but all of New England, because not only are there, deceased souls there, but just all of the pain and anguish on both sides, just all the emotion of the jurors and the accusers and the emotions of those being tested. And even if you weren't being accused or an accuser, just worrying that you would be accused had to have been just an emotional roller coaster, you know? So I think everybody at that time period probably just had a lot of emotional juju in their life. This graveyard, it's on Charter Street. It overlooks the South River, and it was built on some land that was set aside by the early townspeople of Salem. It doesn't matter what era you're in. At some point, you realize people die. When people die, you've got to put them someplace. They can't just sit in the corner, right? It gets kind of creepy after a while. And in 1637, they voted, and Salem said, we need a designated burial site because so many people had died. Remember, we talked in our last podcast about sickness in the preceding decade that kind of helped cause the stress and everything that led up to the trials, especially in the years 1628 through 29. And so they said, we need a designated burial site. So they designated this spot. It wasn't really big as far as acreage, but, you know, at the time they didn't really need it. It's only about 2 blocks long. And this is one reason why there's only 347 people there. So it's just not very big. But holy cow, it packs a paranormal punch. And they say, I've only been there once, and we weren't there for very long. We didn't have a whole lot of time to do too much wandering. But people that have gone to some of these cemeteries back east, which I have not, say it holds its own with the St. Louis Cemetery number 1, the one in New Orleans, and the Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah that are famously haunted. So this one's just right up there with those. Anybody that's been there, and I felt this when I was there. We were only there for a few minutes, but if you go there and you're sensitive, in any way, you are just overwhelmed with a sensation of sadness and despair. Even just walking through, people have said that they just feel this heavy depression. Just walking by, people have said we just feel this depression, like there's no hope to be found in the world, which, here's your Harry Potter quote, like the Dementors, it just sucks the happiness right out of you. Over the years, people have caught EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, at Old Burying Point. A lot of people have captured photographs, mysterious shadows, lights, orbs, white mists, apparitions, just all the stuff that you would get probably at any cemetery. But one of these apparitions, they believe, belongs to Mary Bright Corey, who died August 28th, 1684. If you remember, 2 podcasts ago, we talked about Giles Corey. This is his wife, and she became one of the victims of the witch trials. They think that this apparition is her. There is another ghost that's been seen. She's the figure of a woman who appears in the back corner of the cemetery. And when people have seen her, she's usually spotted wearing a kind of a powder blue dress, and she's holding a picnic basket. Some people have said that they've seen her accompanied by a young boy, and they believe that these 2 spirits were mother and son and died in a fire.
Are they seeing them burnt up? Is that why they think they died in a fire? Like, are the apparitions burned?
It doesn't say. They didn't say. They just said that they see her. So, but if I were to see a woman in a dress holding a picnic basket, holding a little boy's hand, and they're both burned, that would be terrifying. Sad, very, very sad, but also super creepy. So I don't know if there's some local lore of a mother-son that were burned in a fire. But we know they weren't burned as witches because they didn't do that in Salem. So there's another apparition that's been seen very frequently, and she's known as the Lady in White. But apparently she seems to be a little camera shy because not very many people have gotten her picture, which, I'm sorry, but in paranormal world, it's kind of hard to get a picture of an apparition, so that was not a shocker. I guess people that have seen her apparition will pull their cameras out, but as soon as they pull the camera out, the apparition immediately turns into an orb or vanishes altogether. I guess one person was able to slightly capture part of her before she poofed into a different form. They have seen her spotted in the parking lot of the cemetery. They've seen her at nearby buildings and restaurants. No one's really sure if it's the same apparition or if people are seeing different apparitions. Some people think that the Lady in White and Mary Corey are the same apparition. A lot of people argue about this, and most people say, considering everything that went on at the time and all the angst and all the emotion that went on, so many ghosts, most people think that they're different, that Mary Corey and the Lady in White are different. Some people think the Lady in White was an Irish Catholic immigrant because she usually appears on the outskirts of the cemetery, which is where they buried the Irish part of the community. So yeah, they had some Irish mistreatment, segregation back in the day, just FYI. There are people who love to visit old cemeteries. I am one of them. And there are some cemeteries that I have on my bucket list. That being said, I haven't been to them yet because they're back east. They're kind of hard to get to. I've been to some in Boston, which is kind of cool. My favorite one, and this is a little sacrilegious, but it's funny, and I didn't come up with it. But in Boston, you can actually see there's a pub that's across from an old cemetery, and there's a sign on the pub door because Samuel Adams' headstone is right by the fence. I mean, if you're just walking down the cemetery, you can reach to the fence and just touch Sam Adams' headstone. And the pub across the street says, "This is the only place you can drink a cold Sam Adams while looking at a cold Sam Adams." Anyway, but if you are, one like me that likes to visit cemeteries, this one is definitely on your famous graveyard list. It's not your average ghost city, so here are some other stories that people have said. There's a man named Mike, and he was visiting Old Bearing Point Cemetery. He said that he saw it, and that's all he describes it as it peeking out of the ground. He actually got a picture of it. He claimed that the apparition was just in front of the gravestones, and it looked like a very strange torso wearing a suit, tie, had mutton chops, and was about shoulder height out of the ground. So not long after Mike's visit to the cemetery, two friends, they were younger, were daring each other to go in, and it was just in the middle of the night, so they walked through the graveyard together, and it wasn't long before they saw something that they said, "We are never going to forget that." It was a shadowy apparition that rose up from the ground right out of a gravestone, and so that freaked them out. There were two sisters that had an encounter. They were actually on a ghost tour. They weren't there by themselves. They had never been there before. They were taking a lot of pictures, like most people do when you're in a graveyard and on a ghost tour. And later, when they got home, they were uploading photos on their computer, and they think that they found a paranormal image. And one of the sisters says, "I don't even have to look at the pictures to know something supernatural occurred that night." She says it still haunts her mind to this day. And when you have somebody that says something so emphatically, you kind of believe it. But she doesn't explain what it is. So she just knows it's paranormal, which I think is kind of weird, but there you go. She believes it. It's an unwelcoming sight, even for a graveyard, just because of all the feels. Some people joke that it would give Tim Burton nightmares if you went there. And like I said, I've been there, and it didn't give me nightmares, but it's definitely one of the saddest feeling cemeteries I've been to. A phrase that you see along on the headstones, aside from the death's head, is Memento Mori, which loosely translates into remember death. It's a really cold sensation when you go there. You're standing among ghosts and lost souls that just kind of came from an era of terror. I would call the witch trials, even though it was not a very long time, a very terriful time. Terriful? I'm making up words again. Terrifying time. A lot of locals say that when you go to the cemetery, that it would be very wise to be respectful when you're there. A lot of people think if you misbehave in the cemetery, you're going to get cursed. And the Ghost City tours there in Salem advise that when you leave a couple pennies on the gravestones, it will kind of help most of the restless spirits. And that they will leave you alone if you leave them a little bit of money.
So they won't follow you home, basically.
Yeah. In fact, they'll advise their tourists. They say before you leave a few pennies. Leave some change, which I thought was interesting. But I'll tell you what, the lady that talks about how terrifying her vision, her paranormal thing caught on camera, it's like, tell us more. Driving me nuts.
Yeah. I don't know what it is. It's just paranormal.
Yeah,
what does that mean?
She said she instantly knew it was paranormal, and then she just clammed up about it.
Oh.
So.
Okay. Nice. I know when I'm in Europe, I've been Ireland, we've talked about it, Rome, Malta. Those graveyards are some of the most beautiful graveyards. They're pieces of art. It's like going to a museum. I don't know that I see the same type of gravestones, headstones here, but I haven't been back east. And I'm kind of, as you're talking, I'm visualizing like I'm in Europe. They're the bigger, more like with the weeping angel, just real, I don't know, pieces of art, statues. There's some cemeteries out there that are just amazingly beautiful.
Oh, there
in a sick way.
Yes, I think the favorite cemetery I've ever been to is on Prince's Street in Edinburgh. I think it's Prince's Street, but it's from the body snatcher era, and they've got the towers where the guards would watch to make sure people didn't come and snatch bodies. But it's got the old little church in there, and it's just overgrown, and all the there's trees just dripping with, I don't know, just spooky feels, and it's dark even in the middle of the day, and all the headstones are covered in moss and tipping sideways, and I love that cemetery. And I get now, it's
when
they put them. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that when I was in Ireland, we went to many areas on a couple of tours where there would be dilapidated churches, and inside the churches had now become cemeteries. When you go into like the Catholic churches, and I don't know if it is this way in this country because I haven't been into that many Catholic churches in this country, maybe back east, but there are people buried under the floors and the grounds, and their headstones are part of the flooring in the church.
Yeah, that's what
Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, in England. I don't know here because I don't go to a whole lot of Catholic churches here. But when I was in England, you'd go into Westminster Abbey and the churches there, and yeah, the floors were pretty much all just headstones.
I did watch a YouTube video not too long ago where it was a newer Catholic church in Los Angeles. It was kind of right by the freeway. They did have a mausoleum down underneath it. I don't know if they had burials right in the chapel itself or the cathedral part itself, but the cathedral itself has a mausoleum in the basement. They went and did that. It's Hollywood Graveyard YouTube videos. Very, very fascinating to watch.
So I love old cemeteries, but I've got some stories from some other cemeteries across the nation. So I just had a couple other stories. Then this didn't happen at the Salem. These happened in other places, and I got looking online. You can find cemetery stories all over the place. I'll just tell you a couple more, and then we'll move on. This is in Colorado. The cemetery is called Silver Cliff Cemetery, and it's nearby a mining town of Silver Cliff. This mine had just an abundance of ore, but bad management. And because of the bad management, and as they say, and I will quote, financial shenanigans, ran the company into the ground 3 times. Not once, 3 times. Today, the cemetery is famous for dancing blue lights. Even National Geographic published an article about the lights in 1969. People that have seen these say that they're small, round, they come in other colors besides blue sometimes, but these lights will dance across the gravestones. Some people that are boring say they're reflections of light from the town, but there have been sightings of these lights before electricity came to Silver Cliff. So, and the reason I say they're boring is because I will debunk stuff. because you have to be credible. But it made me very happy to hear that sightings were recorded before electricity, because dancing blue lights, come on, that's amazing.
That is. That sounds like a wisp.
It's like fairies.
Like wisps.
Like wisps. And the last one is called Step Cemetery. It's abandoned. It's in Morgan Monroe State Forest in Indiana. There's actually only a couple of dozen graves here. A lot of them go back to about 200 years old. It's officially a local family cemetery, but legend says that it was founded by a cult called the Crabites. And the Crabites apparently had rituals which included snake handling and sex orgies. Some people say that they can still hear chanting of the gatherings in the cemetery at night. However, if you get looking around, you just can't really find any reference to the Crabites out of some local stories. So
there's very little. In fact, I just saw a YouTube video on this afternoon about the Crabites in the cemetery, and they've said the exact same thing. You can go out on the internet, there's just not very much about that Crabite group at all.
Right. So I kind of think that
might be lore.
Might be some lore. I'm not too excited about that one. But because of it, it gets kind of urban legend status. But there's a story that says a devoted mother stayed at the grave of her infant every day. You know, the infant died. The mother was so distraught she went every day, which is amazing. I mean, that's very loving. But they say that even after she died, she still went to this grave. And another story from the cemetery says that the crying sounds that are heard are from an old woman who cursed the cemetery after a fraternity group killed her dog and left its body at the cemetery. So the stories are all over the place, but apparently there's enough going on at the cemetery that warrants stories being told about it. So it would be one that would be interesting to go to and see what it's all about.
That was very interesting. There's so much more about graveyard stories out there. Just go out to the internet and you can see lots of things. Go out on YouTube. There's lots of stories that are out there. We just scratched the surface.
So I'm going to tell you one more really quick.
Oh, okay.
My grandpa, when after he was married and my mom was little, he moved up to Idaho and taught school for a little while. And part of his job, this was a tiny, tiny, tiny little town that he lived in called Meat Creek, Idaho. And behind the church was kind of your quintessential little cemetery. Yeah, I always think of a church and then the cemetery behind it. Yeah, this was the deal. And his job was to go up and take care of the cemetery. And so he would go up and drag the irrigation sprinklers around and, clean up the plastic flowers after Memorial Day, sort of a thing. And I don't know how everyone else's grandpa is, but my grandpa kind of had a grandpa uniform. He wore khaki carpenter pants, a white t-shirt, and a baseball hat. And so he's up there, and it's dark. It's in the summer, it's late. And he's just getting ready to finish up what he's doing and walk across the street to go home, because he lived across the street from the church. And I don't remember. I'm sure after my family listens to this podcast, I'll get a phone call. I don't know if he did this on purpose or if it was accidental, but he had bent down behind a headstone. I don't know if it was to pick a weed, to move a sprinkler, but a car was coming up the road, and he stood up. So, it's dark. As he stands up, they can see his white t-shirt in the dark, and I guess they just got super scared and drove away. I don't know if he did it on purpose or if it was an accident, but he scared the soul out of somebody, and they drove.
So is that it? That's the last story?
Oh, there's more, but we're running out of time.
Yeah. On blog.feedspot.com, if you go under supernatural_podcasts, that blog, it's new and it has their top 30 supernatural podcasts. And we are ranked number 10. So we're really excited about that. That all comes down to you guys and your listenership. They talk about how the rankings are done. And this is literally out of hundreds or if not thousands of podcasts in the supernatural area. So we are really excited about that.
Yeah, and we didn't get there by ourselves. It banks a lot on how many listens and how many likes and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and it says the ranking is based on relevancy, industry blogs, blog post frequency, freshness, social media accounts and engagements, domain authority, the age of the blog, and the web traffic. So this is, a reflection of our listeners, and we really, really appreciate it. We're really excited for this kind of recognition from FeedSpot.
So awesome.
Also, check out our shop at advancedparanormal.com, where you can find our sage sprays, our sage and lavender rollers, lip balms, just different items that we've got up for sale. Also, follow us on YouTube and TikTok.
All right. Well, stay spooky, my haunty friends.
Love you, Nicholas.
Hey, have a good night.
You've been listening to the Supernatural Hour at AdvancedParanormal.com. The Supernatural Hour is part of the Radio Ronin network found at RadioRonin.com. Copyright 2021 by Advanced Paranormal Services.